let's get into the big topic of open source, something that we actually say at Red Hat.
We haven't
This is so
we
awesome.
are an open culture that believes
actually
in
a big
importance of
piece
What is that process that a developer, or let's say
as the Kubernetes ecosystem really boomed.
All right, hello and welcome to this week's Ask an OpenShift Admin Office Hour. I am very privileged and very lucky to be joined by two of my favorite people here at Red Hat. My reoccurring guest host, Mr. Johnny Rickard. How are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you?
It's a great day at Red Hat. Here in North Carolina, it's gray and rainy, but it's a great Red Hat day. We had a recharge day last week, which was very, very nice. Good to get a little bit of time to, I don't know about you, but I did a whole lot of nothing as much as I possibly could.
I did as much nothing as possible as well. And the cool part about it is I found out on the 17th that 18th was a recharge day. So I was like, this is going to be a great day. So yeah, it was awesome.
Yeah, it's I can't say I did nothing. I for US folks, it's tax season, so I had the great privilege of assembling all of our tax documents. Lots of fun. Yeah.
I'm that guy. I wait till the last minute. I'm that one.
Oh no, I always try and get it done as early as possible just to get the pain out of the way.
I should. I know I should, but I hate it.
Yeah. So we are also joined today by Daniel Messer, and I apologize, Daniel, if I just butchered your last name. I think you've joined us on the stream before, but it was in early days. It was a while ago.
It was definitely a while ago. Yeah. I think we've talked a lot about one of my products. So I'm a product manager here at Red Hat in the Openshift group, and one of my products is Quay, Red Hat Quay to be precise, and also the SaaS version of that, Quay.io. So, and I think we talked a lot about how you would set up Quay if you're running your own data center and your own cloud region. And we demoed setting up Quay in an HA fashion using traditional virtual machines, and me in iTerm and free parallel windows open, receiving broadcast input to do configurations across free machines. So, a very rudimentary demo of how you would install it for sure.
Yeah, so I know we were talking just before we started of you're the guy who gets all the complaints anytime Quay.io has any blips in availability or anything like that. So
yeah, I tend to, and there's nothing wrong with that, of course, right? So we'll always work towards making the service better and more available, increasing the uptime. Sometimes we stumble, right? But we are continuously improving the service. We've just actually conducted a fairly large migration of the code base. So if you're familiar with, Python, Quay is written in Python, and Python, the community essentially discontinued Python version 2, right? And so we had to migrate the whole code base to Python v3. So you can imagine, how many thousands of lines of code of a large SaaS.
It's a small undertaking, yeah.
Is a little bit entertaining, right? So worked long and hard to get up until last Sunday, where we actually did the migration and finished it. And pretty excited about what Quay will have to offer this year.
Yeah, it's Quay is it's almost like a sleeper product, right? Like everybody knows it's there, but I don't think a lot of people really know what it does or really what its capabilities are. So I'm looking forward to learning more today.
Absolutely, it's part of the invisible plumbing that makes all the higher level, cool looking stuff work. But it's pretty important.
Yeah, definitely.
The product behind the product.
So
the platform below the platform, I would say.
Yeah. I feel like that's definitely a product manager's point of view, right? So before we move on to today's topic, I do want to cover a few things. So first and foremost, this is one of the Office Hours series of live streams here on Red Hat Live Streaming. And what that means is that just like if you've ever had a manager or a teacher or anybody like that who had an open door office hours type of policy, we're here for you. Whatever questions you have about OpenShift, whatever's on the top of your mind, please don't hesitate to ask that in chat on whatever platform you happen to be watching us on. The service that we use here, Restream, it rebroadcasts, resends all of those chat messages across all of them. So it doesn't matter where you're at, we'll see your messages and we'll do our best to answer those questions. And as I like to highlight and point out, Johnny and I and our guest Daniel today, right? We only know so much, so we will do our best to answer your questions here on the stream. If we can't, then we're happy to take those back. We'll go and talk with whoever we need to inside of Red Hat, whether it's the product management team, the engineering team. I have had to reach out to the product marketing team even a few times, surprisingly. We'll get those answers and then we'll follow up with those, whether it's in a following stream, in the blog post that comes out, or you can always reach out to us directly. So on social media, you can find me at Practical Andrew on Twitter. And I've also recently started paying attention to Reddit as well, the OpenShift subreddit. So if anybody happens to be on there, it's another way to contact us. And you can also, of course, reach out to me via email if you'd like. And my email address is there in the corner, andrew.sullivan@redhat.com. So with that being said, again, don't hesitate to ask any questions that you have at any point in time, and we'll keep up with those in chat. I'd like to talk about some of our top of mind topics. So top of mind topics are things that we talk about, kind of every week or every stream, and it's things that we feel are important or have come up recently that might be interesting to you all, to our audience. So the first one of these that I have on the list here is actually a follow-up from last week when we had Frank Bodden on to talk about the performance add-on operator. And I got an email afterwards asking about some configuration things that have to do with OpenShift deployed onto Red Hat virtualization and hyperthreading configuration. And I'll admit, it's been a few minutes since I had to think about hyperthreading and all of the stuff that's inside of there. And this was a really fascinating question to chase down and work with our, KVM performance team to find out what's going on here. So the short version is effectively in Red Hat virtualization, you have the option of specifying not just the number of cores per CPU or per socket, but the number of threads per core per socket. And so effectively the question was, should I set the number of threads to be, 2? Because, if hyperthreading is turned on, then, in theory, each core has 2 threads that are available to it. And the response that I got back was one that it makes sense, although it didn't occur to me at the time when the question was first asked. And that is essentially under normal circumstances. So let's ignore OpenShift for a moment. Under normal circumstances, you would want to set that value to be equal to the number of cores that show up or the number of threads that show up from the output of like an LSCPU. So on your Rev hypervisor nodes, you would go in, you would look at that, you would set it to that value. And this is important when you're doing things like CPU pinning, because as we talked about on the stream, things like NUMA awareness, all of that other stuff, it can provide some tangible performance benefits. With OpenShift, on the other hand, because there's now an additional scheduler, an additional layer of abstraction inside of there, the response I got back from the engineering team was more or less, we don't know, but we don't think that there's going to be substantial benefit that's available there. So they recommended keeping it set to the default of 1 thread per core per socket. So long-winded way of saying, if you want to choose it, you're not going to invalidate support. You're not going to do anything like that. But definitely be sure to test both before and after so that you can verify that it is a benefit, It is positive effect on your applications that are running inside of there. Because, best practices or even recommendations are not always universal. They're not always global. So I always recommend testing there. And they did also point out to me, I'm going to share my screen here. See, I want a window and I want this guy. So they did point me to, literally as we were asking this question, you can see last Thursday, which is the day after the stream, was KubeVirt Summit. So KubeVirt is the upstream project behind OpenShift virtualization. And it utilizes KVM, it utilizes all of the same things that effectively Red Hat virtualization and RHEL, et cetera, do as well. And basically what they pointed out to me was there's a session that is exactly around what this particular question was asking. So that should be posted to the YouTube channel. and I thought I had a link. So it should be posted to the Kubert YouTube channel in the coming days. I think they usually have a lag of somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks. But if that's something that's interesting to you, definitely go in and look for that. I know that they do a great job of getting that up onto their YouTube channel, and hopefully that'll help us to dig in. Is there any questions, Johnny? Anything that we should?
Yeah, there's a few coming in about Quay
Okay.
specifically, but I figure we'll let Daniel answer those since they are right in his wheelhouse. There is one question from Alvaro, and sorry if I just butchered your name, but he's asking like, hey, what do I need to keep in mind when I'm migrating from Rancher to OpenShift?
Yeah, so in theory, it should work exactly the same. So the reason why I say that is because Rancher is a quote unquote vanilla Kubernetes, right? When you're deploying like an RKE or something like that. And OpenShift is Kubernetes with some things added on top. So usually the things that most people are concerned about is creating ingresses, right? An ingress object versus a route object. And OpenShift will automatically create a route when you create an ingress. Some things do change. So for example, with an ingress, you can specify a secret to use for the certificates. Whereas with a route, you add that certificate information in directly to the route object. I believe that it will automatically accommodate that as well. Basically, it'll automatically create the route with all of that information inside of it. So in theory, it'll work exactly the way that you would expect. Of course, I always recommend, that you test and validate. And you also have the option of using the migration toolkit. So if we look at, and I can never remember the product URL, but if we look at the conveyor project, I'm sharing my screen. Yep. So here, so the conveyor project, which is the upstream project for the migration toolkit for applications, you can essentially deploy this into your OpenShift cluster and then point it at the existing cluster, point it at the new cluster, and say, hey, I want to migrate this application and all of the Kubernetes objects associated with it into my the destination cluster, and it'll handle doing all of that for you. So including migrating data. So I think there is 2 strategies for that, right? Where you can, thank you, I don't need a subscription. So where you can either have it literally copy the data. So, mount the PVC in the source cluster, mount a new PVC in the destination cluster and have it copy the data from one to the other. Or you can have it, I don't remember the terminology they use. It's either move or rehome or something like that, where assuming it's on an external storage system that is accessible by both clusters, it'll create a new PVC or a new PV in the destination cluster and a PVC to map to it so that it can connect to both. We should really, I need to take down a note that we should really have the migration team on. So
Yeah, definitely. That'd be awesome. So and one thing to add to what you're just saying, Andrew, is like another a consideration to make is when you're coming from K3s or native Kubernetes, right? And you're going to OpenShift, all of your pods in OpenShift are restricted out of the box, right? So that's going to be an issue if you're coming from Kubernetes and you haven't built your application for security, right? Or I hate to say it like that, but like if you're not using SECs or pod security policies or anything like that, then if you're running everything as root or trying to use any UID, that's going to be an issue when you come over to OpenShift. So it's just something to be aware of.
Yeah, that's a great point. The security policies in OpenShift are much more strict than most other Kubernetes, whatever.
Kubernetes.
So things like no root in the containers and all of that. So yeah, that is probably going to be the hardest part if you haven't already accommodated that in the application. Let's see. Next one that I've got on the list here. We updated the subscription guide. So this is one. It's a little bit self-serving because I'm a part of the update process. So we updated it here. You can see it happened February 8th. I might have mentioned this last week. I don't know. I described John to yesterday. Johnny and I were chatting, and I described my day yesterday as basically like imagine a ball of cats that you just like set in the middle of the floor and let go, and they all scatter in 100 different directions. That's been my week the last week. So. My apologies if I already mentioned this, but the two big updates that we had in this particular release are one, and I think I scrolled to the right place. One, we specifically highlighted that with OpenShift virtualization, guest entitlements for RHEL virtual machines are included. So if you are using OpenShift virtualization, you deploy RHEL VMs, those entitlements are included as a part of your OpenShift subscription. And then the other one, which is related, tangential to today, is there has been a number of updates to include the various OpenShift Platform Plus components. Quay is, of course, a part of that. We'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. But they added in the OpenShift Data Foundation Essentials stuff in here. So if you happen to be interested in that, we talked briefly about Data Foundation Essentials recently. It's included with those Platform Plus, OpenShift Platform Plus entitlements up to, I think, 256 terabytes of capacity. So, and I'm not paying attention. I think Stephanie, she's on it. Stephanie in the background here is posting links before I even remember that I need to post links here. So thank you, Stephanie. All right, just I've got a couple of other ones here. I just want to hit them quickly. So we've had a number of questions. It's one of those, when it rains, it pours things. So I've been asked a number of times recently of specifically to OpenShift virtualization for some reason, but can we deploy RHEL CoreOS as a standalone operating system? So kind of like we used to be able to do with Atomic or CoreOS Container Linux. So before CoreOS became a part of Red Hat. The answer to that is no. RHEL CoreOS is it is not meant to be used standalone. It can only be used as an OpenShift node and only supported when used in conjunction with OpenShift. Right? You can't. We sort of alluded to that, or it's sort of the same as when we talked about the various CVEs and security bulletins and all that. They don't call out, Red Hat Enterprise Linux CoreOS as being an affected platform. It's OpenShift is the affected platform because you can't get CoreOS without OpenShift. Next one, this is one that I didn't know about this, and it's more because I like the docs are just huge and massive. But somebody had asked, is there a way that I can limit the bandwidth that a pod is consuming? And it turns out, yes, it's actually a built-in functionality. So you can see it's very simple annotation to go in and say, I want to limit the ingress and egress bandwidth. So this came up in the context of, I want to figure out, or I want to find out what happens if I limit my application to a very low bandwidth, right? Is it going to cause a ripple effect of other things to my application? And I was watching the email thread about it and was interested, and turned out it was a very easy thing to do. I was expecting it to be some arcane magic and like the, using OVN commands or something like that at the CLI, but it works as you would expect. And then last but not least, just a real quick reminder for upcoming streams. So Johnny and I have been planning out the next few streams that are coming up. Next week, we are probably going to look at, and not just next week, but maybe the week after as well. We'll be looking at some OpenShift 4.10 stuff. So last week, we didn't have this stream because of the What's New presentation from the product management team, Daniel included in that. But we want to dig into some of the features, some of the things that are coming out. So rather than having that kind of high level, here's what's happening, it's let's dig in and let's see what's really changed and how it works. So we've got some ideas for things. There's some stuff that Johnny and I are both interested in. If there's anything that you all, the audience, are interested in, if anything you'd like to see us dig into, please send us a message. Please reach out. We'd be happy to look at that and see if we can find some SMEs if needed in order to bring on and really to talk about and dig down into those. So, and then also coming up in March, we have finally, our Hope 9, I see you're in the chat there. We have finally identified somebody who is willing to come on and talk about service mesh. I feel like we've been trying to find somebody for the last year or so. But one of the folks on my team, Ortwin, is going to be coming on to the stream to talk about service mesh and all the really cool stuff that we can do there. So I'm looking forward to finally getting that on the stream here. So be sure to subscribe to the channel, whatever platform you happen to be on. Subscribe to the channel. You can also go to red.ht/livestream you'll land at the live streaming landing page, and on there is a calendar. You can subscribe to that calendar if you'd like, and then you can get updates on all of our various streams. Okay, I'm done with all of that. Let's talk about Quay. And when we first started talking about this topic, and kind of the title, as you will, even references directly the OpenShift mirror registry. And the OpenShift mirror registry is one of the more, it's not one of the more visible things, but I think it's one of the things that has caught a lot of folks' attention because it solves a very tangible problem, right? And the result has been some increased awareness of Quay itself, which is kind of how we arrived at today's topic. So Daniel, as the product manager, can you tell us about the mirror registry, kind of what it is, as well as the use cases and limitations surrounding it? And then I do want to, I've got a quick little CLI thing that I'll show of, hey, what does it look like to actually deploy this thing?
Sure. Maybe just to level set, at this point, we're going to assume that everybody kind of knows what a container registry is, like at a very fundamental level. So I'm going to skip that part. If there's interest in diving into that, just let us know in the chat. But yeah, so it turns out that OpenShift, but really any Kubernetes to work, needs a registry, right? OpenShift is a bit more special in that sense, in the sense that all of its parts are also containerized, right? So if you look at what runs on Arcos, these are containers, right? So the API server, the scheduler, NCD, all of these fundamental things run as containers as well. And if you know a little bit about containers, you know that they have to come from somewhere. The place where they're running is not the place where they are stored, right? You pull them down from these registries. So OpenShift has a day zero requirement for a registry when you want to install it from. Now, normally you don't really see or know about this because when you are using the OpenShift installer, you're connected to the internet, and that's where the container images are downloaded from a Red Hat registry. It's actually going to be Quay.io, but also registry.redhat.io, which is a proxy for Quay.io. So for customers who are not connected to the internet, you have a little bit of a problem, right? Because you're behind your firewall, and you have a green field, right? Nothing is running there. You have a bunch of new servers, you want to run OpenShift on them. So how do you do that if you don't have a registry, right? You can't. So you need to think about that first. You kind of need a registry to store all the OpenShift images that are used at installation time, and then also later when the cluster is running, right? And what people have done so far about this is either they had already some registry running behind the firewall out of historic reasons. So people use Quay, others use other registries. Again, others kind of resort back to a upstream solution where you have, upstream CNCF distribution registry running in Parkman, in a single node, in a single system using local disk storage. And that's fine, right? Technically, this will work. But it creates a couple of problems, right? So the first problem is if you're paying for OpenShift subscription, you're enjoying all that great support we give you, but that one tiny piece in front of it that makes it all work is kind of unsupported. So that's maybe not a good long-term strategy, right? And I'm saying this because you will want to update this registry over time, just for the mere purpose of getting rid of CVEs. And what you also want is getting rid of content that you don't need anymore, right? And maybe you want to also manage who can actually access that content, right? It's essentially licensed software or software that you pay subscription money for that's in there, so you don't want to open it up to the world. So you want to have a real registry there, right? With some UI and proper management features. So
And it's
OpenShift Mirror Registry gives you that, right?
so
And
sorry
it
to
gives you
interrupt.
that in a very
Sorry to
Sure.
interrupt you. I just want to I want to highlight that very much to your point here. When Johnny and I did the disconnected deep dive 4 months ago, we weren't ready to show the mirror registry at that point. So I think, and I can dig up the gist. Like, we use the upstream Docker registry and all of the stuff associated with it. And one of the challenges of that is, Quay has this really nice, really robust management interface where I can go in and exactly as you just said, manage that content and all of that other stuff. So Whereas with the upstream registry, that isn't there. Like, yes, you can technically go in and prune images using the API and stuff like that, but it's kind of rough. So for me, who is going through and it's, now it's, well, I still have a registry, in my lab environment that I want to continue to use, but how do I prune off the tens of gigabytes of images that I need to? And so yeah, I'm very excited. I'm happy to roll over everything that I have in my lab over to the mirror registry. And to me, and you kind of touched on it, but didn't outright call it out, which is for me, having a mirror of the registry for an install on premises is really helpful because I mean, yeah, it's my home lab, right? So I'm using residential internet service and all that other stuff. And even though it's a gigabit, fiber link, it can still take a fair bit of time to pull down all of the images every time I'm doing a cluster deploy. And, I've talked with partners before who, as a part of their CI system, they're, one of our storage partners, they're building their CSI provider. And then a part of the testing process is to deploy an OpenShift cluster. And they want one that's running, the latest 4.6, 4.7, 4.8, 4.9, because those are all the currently supported versions. And, it takes a non-inconsequential amount of time to pull that stuff down. And what they told me is they cut that time in half, the time to deploy a cluster in half by having it all local. So sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, and just to key in
No.
some more stuff there, Daniel, is you guys you're checking all the boxes that a lot of our enterprises are having problems with right now with the upstream registry, right? Where they're trying to use like a Nexus or an Artifactor or something like that. So that way they have authentication built in and TLS and stuff like that. Because I mean, with Docker, you can do TLS, but to get an authenticated registry, you actually have to kind of work some magic to kind of, put something in front of it. So that way you can hit the, HTTP access or something like that first, where this is all out of the box and native. And I'm super excited. I'm with Andrew. I'm in the fanboy boat on this big time. So sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to add that.
That's the whole premise, right? We want to make the disconnected installation easier. We've received a lot of feedback over the last couple of years since OpenShift 4 was brought into the world that this part of it is where you have to do more pre-work, right? And it's involving a lot of different tools, and in the case of registry, even third-party upstream tools. So that's really what we wanted to kind of simplify. So you don't have to worry about where this comes from, how this is maintained, how you update it. You just download a thing from Red Hat that gives you that. And that thing is called the mirror registry. And it has this installer, right, which has literally one command, which is install, and it will install a streamlined, reduced Quay deployment on a system. So you just need RHEL 8 and Podman, and that's pretty much it. And then you get going to the next step. This is what we wanted people to do, right? We don't want people to be stuck with, oh, how do I set up a registry? How do I make sure people have access? How do I ensure it's properly secured with credentials or TLS certificates? So all of that is like out of the box there with the installer. So it's just a checkbox that you can check, and then you proceed to the next step, which is actually what takes more time, which is mirroring all these images down, right? So there was a question in the chat: is Quay the only thing where I can mirror stuff into, right? And the answer is no. You can use any OCI compatible registry. We don't test all of them, to be honest, because some of them have their own implementation of the Docker V2 protocol that comes with a couple of gotchas, right? So we give in our documentation a couple of hints of what you can use, Quay, amongst other things like Artifactory or Nexus. So all of these are supported options for a commercial enterprise customer. But if you don't have anything, now you have the mirror registry, and it's part of OpenShift. It's part of the subscription. There's no additional cost to it. You just get it with your first cluster. You get supported it as part of your OpenShift entitlement, and then you kind of are able to proceed to the next step. So we really want to cut down the time it really takes to get the disconnected environment up and running by really cutting down the amount of prerequisites that you need to do. So mirror registry was one part of that, for sure.
So I think I'm going to actually skip doing the demo. I just wanted to kick off the install process, which is really straightforward. And actually, instead of showing that, I'm going to paste the video that you created, Daniel, here into chat. So that way, if folks do want to see what it looks like to deploy it, they can go and see that. But what I wanted to do instead of that, because we do still want to see Quay itself, which you have up and running, is let's spend a couple minutes on the questions that have come in so far and see if we can answer a number of those for folks. So Johnny, I'm scrolling back through the chat here just to find what we haven't answered yet. Do you have a list?
Yep. So I put it in our internal chat. It's basically, I think Daniel started keying in on some of them, but
Okay.
The one was about like if I have, is it possible with Quay high availability to set up different retention policies for images? For example, I have one node keeping images for a different period of time over the others.
So in the registry, you don't think about nodes, right? The registry is like a service that consists of multiple nodes for high availability and scale out reasons. So in the registry, you kind of think about it as a big bucket of container images, and you manage these buckets and the contents inside at the registry level. So we actually segregate the registry into what we call organizations. Others call these namespaces, but really what it is, it's like a namespace in Kubernetes, right? And there, at this level, you have users and you have content that's managed there. And in that level, you have repositories, which is really what holds the images, right? And at that level, you can do retention. What Quay does today is it allows you to set expiration of an image at the tag level. So you can actually say this tag that I just pushed is going to be good for the next 2 weeks, and then you need to pull down a new one, right? So that's what we do in retention today. We are working on some stuff for the future where we are sort of listening to our users who say, I have a lot of tenants in Quay. I need to kind of keep the storage growth in check because they are eating up all my precious, expensive enterprise storage, right? So I need to kind of put some barriers up. So one thing we're going to do in the next version of Quay 3.7 is we're going to have quota management being implemented. So you can actually put a limit up per tenant or organization, how many gigabytes of images they can store inside. So, and that will be enforced at some point with a hard limit. So when the limit is reached, let's say 10 gigs and no more, you can't push any more images into it. In the future version of Quay, we're going to be a little bit more intelligent about it. We'll allow people to define retention policies that tell you, or that tell Quay what should happen if that limit is reached, right? Maybe you want to delete some of the older tags, right? And maybe you want to sort by semantic versioning because you're releasing software that way. And it's probably fine for a developer cluster so that the version of like 0.5.7 from 4 weeks ago isn't there anymore, right? So that's how you can keep growth in check. But tag expiration is what we have today. It allows you to set a time, and after the time, the tag will be orphaned and will not be able anymore.
And does that, when that expires, does it also remove the image layers in the cluster or in the registry itself?
That's a good question. So the image layers in Quay are shared on a global basis, which is very storage efficient, right? So you can imagine many people upload images to Quay.io, and many of that are using UBI. The UBI base layer will only be stored once in the whole Quay.io deployment. So Red Hat Quay, the downstream product, which is using the same code base as Quay.io, does the same. When you kind of delete or orphan an image, what happens is that the tag will be removed, but the layers may not be removed if they are referenced by other images because you have layer sharing going on, right? So, but from a user perspective, the image tag will sort of be gone.
I think you might have just skipped over something pretty important there, which is you just said that Quay.io and Quay are the same code base. So, for folks who are wondering like scalability and performance and all that other stuff, we have a pretty good idea of what that looks like.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive. So, like if you look at the numbers, pretty confident this is one of the largest public registry services out there. So we have like over 2.4 billion container images pulled through Quay every month, right? So there's a sizable traffic that comes from OpenShift clusters, but there's also a very large audience of community projects out there that are using Quay.io to distribute their containers, right? Some of them very well-known open source projects. So the numbers in like storage consumption and traffic that it generates out through the CDN is just mind-boggling. But that's what Quay has been, designed to do. It's a scale-out registry, And that's important because if you think about kind of where the future is going, right? Kubernetes and OpenShift is sort of ubiquitous, right? And you get a cluster in like 10 minutes. And when we have things like Hypershift, you may get them in like 2 minutes. So getting a cluster is very cheap. And now you're able to say, yeah, every development team gets a cluster if they want, even for a temporary thing, because it becomes cheap, right? So with that in abundance, you need a sort of a central approach to software management, which is what Quay gives you, right? It's containerized software, and it's the central source of truth for distributing that. So when you do that, when you put all your apps in one basket like this, you better make sure that basket is pretty big and also very stable, right? Because if you lose that central registry, even for just 5 minutes, trust me, you will know in your running clusters very, very soon that this is the case, right? So registries need to have a very high uptime, and Quay is, geared toward that in the first design principle because it's scale out, right? The whole design of the registry is scale out. It's the presentation there, like the image serving there, is essentially stateless. There are stateful parts of the backend, like the blob storage, for instance, that actually holds the image layers, right? There's also a database that indexes where all the layers are, or what your username is, what your credentials are. But the serving layer, that is the most important thing. That's scale out, right? So you can run hundreds of Quay instances in OpenShift in pods, and therefore have a very highly available registry that will give you assurance, right?
It's funny because I kind of poked at it earlier when you said that it's the platform behind the platform and stuff like that, and the registry should absolutely be considered a core service, right? In my opinion, it's in line with things like DHCP and DNS as providing that core. If it's down, things aren't going to work type of functionality. Last week I participated in a demo, and one of the things that we showed was like using an OpenShift pipeline to build an application to push to a distributed Quay instance, and then using Ansible to then push those images out to rel at the edge. And it's one of those, like, it's not we're not talking about just impacting OpenShift hosted application instances. We're talking about many things now are running on rel nodes, are running on individual nodes, all across the data center and the edge and everywhere in between. They're running applications in containers. So it's the registry is a core and central part of that. So I did want to touch on, I'm reading through chat here. There's a couple of questions here. What is an image stream? It's quite something like satellite, Khalid. So that one, that's an interesting one. I hadn't thought about it that way. They are slightly similar in that they are a content repository, but satellite offers some other functionality as well for things like registering and entitling systems and stuff like that. Whereas Quay is a container image registry, right? So it's reaching out or providing that storage for those container images. Is it the same as OpenShift Serverless? No. So Serverless, or I don't think they're the same. This is Andrew showing his ignorance when it comes to these things. I don't think Serverless and functions as a service are sort of similar to me. So Serverless would be, I am able to define and provide a piece of code directly to the cluster, and the cluster takes that piece of code and any triggers around it and implements that. So what do I mean by that? Let's say that I have a function that just multiplies two numbers, and then I have something that it subscribes to, or some sort of trigger endpoint that it hits. And when it says it gets that input, it fires up that function, usually in a pod, and then executes that service or that function, and then terminates. Whereas Quay would be just a regular, enterprise application that's running inside of there.
And I may have misunderstood that question too. I thought he was asking if Knative was the same as OpenShift Serverless, and if that's not the case, then that's my fault.
So Knative is a component of OpenShift Serverless.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, good call. I missed the context in amongst all of these other things.
So the latest question is, does Quay have a verified publisher program? So kind of like Docker Hub, where like you have like this, this is my stuff, right? It's authorized or verified. Does Quay have a similar? feature?
Yeah, so the question pertains to Quay.io. So I think here on the screen, kind of need to differentiate between Quay or Project Quay, the upstream technology, and Red Hat Quay, the downstream product that you can install and run yourself from the data center. And then Quay.io, which is our hosted version of Quay. Same code base. Not all features are enabled for obvious reasons, but the answer is Quay.io today does not have a verified publisher program. So that's something where we are looking at, the market to tell us if there's actually interest for that, right? And that's where you guys kind of need to make some noise and say, we want something like this. So Quay.io and Red Hat Quay as open source project are very open, right? So we have a Jira in which you can actually follow the whole development stream, like all the releases, all the updates, all the features that are coming. And you can also raise RPs, right? You can also raise GitHub issues if it's pertaining to Quay technology itself. But I think the Red Hat Quay Jira would be a good place to kind of, raise those RPs. All you need is Red Hat account, and we're always looking to hear back from you as users and interested people to know about this. Right now, it does not have that, but it's probably an interesting thing to think about in the future. We have quite admittedly seen a bit of an update in Quay since certain our registry offerings like Docker Hub, for instance, changed policies around how much of the free tier you can still use. So I think something like this could really work well when there's interest also from the projects to use Quay.io as the primary distribution mechanism and to give it a little bit more of a official experience and like first class experience. But as of today, it does not have that.
Awesome. And then we kind of talked about this in chat on the side when we were going through the initial build up, but if you have one Quay and several OpenShift clusters, can you use the bridging operator on, say, 4 clusters and use the one Quay to rule them all?
That's the case. Yeah, that's true. So what the bridge operator does, for people who don't know, it's a thing you install in OpenShift. And the bridge operator will give you the same type of integration that OpenShift used to have, or actually still has, with the integrated internal image registry, right? So if you think about image streams, S2I builds, build automation inside OpenShift using these primitives, that is all coming off the internal registry, right? Where you transparently, push the image to the internal registry, and then it's triggering redeployments of your software. Now that the registry with Quays outside of the cluster, that integration was not available. And this gap was filled by the Quay bridge operator. And the bridge operator gives you back all this automation so that when you create a namespace in OpenShift, you have an organization in Quay. You have, when you have an image stream in that namespace in OpenShift, you have a repository with the same name in that Quay organization. You also have the pull secrets and access credentials be automatically pulled down into OpenShift with a so-called robot account that Quay has in order to give you access without giving out the user password, right? So all of these things are orchestrated in the background by the Quay bridge operator, which makes dealing with S2I and image streams and builds in OpenShift very, very natural, as if it were the internal registry, but it's the external one. The one thing you need to be aware of is that when you're using names in one cluster to name things in the central Quay instance, you need to ensure that there's no collision. QBO makes sure, Quay bridge operator makes sure that doesn't happen, because it prefixes all the namespaces and organizations and repositories in Quay that it creates as part of that automation with the cluster ID that the bridge operator is running on. So you only need to make sure that your various clusters by default have different cluster IDs, and that's what disambiguates potentially similarly or equally named namespaces in OpenShift, right? So yes, the answer is yes, you have one central Quay, and you have n OpenShift clusters all run the Quay bridge operator, and they would happily run alongside each other, no problem.
Awesome. And then one last question, I'm sorry, Andrew, is
you're good.
And this is because like this is coming up quite a bit about like essentially the purpose of the Quay the Quay mirror registry versus like getting content into the registry, right? I think that like there's 2 different paths here, right? You have Quay, the mirror registry, which is really your mechanism to get images to the cluster, right? And then there's mirroring the content, right? It's a totally separate process and totally separate pathway. But but there's a tool that's out tech preview in 4.10 called OC Mirror. And one of the questions that we got is OC Mirror and mirror-registry, are they ever going to be conjoined at any point?
I don't think so, to be honest, because we are following Unix philosophy here. Build a tool that does one thing and does it very well. So the mirror registry's sole purpose is to get your registry in like literally under 5 minutes, right? As simple as that. And then there's going to be another tool which is centralizing all our different mirroring approaches into one tool. So that's going to be a separate tool which has only that mission. And you can use that with whatever registry you have. If you have already Quay proper installed, or you have another registry, you can also use OC Mirror with that. But OC Mirror really is the next step to simplify all this prerequisite process of getting a disconnected cluster. Because today you need to follow different documentation steps using different tools to mirror different parts of OpenShift. You need to differentiate between the core images, the core cluster operators, and the optional layered add-on products in form of the OLM managed operators. So these operator catalogs are managed and mirrored in a different way. So it's also different steps and different customization mechanisms. OC Mirror is going to unify all of that in one central tool that does all of this in one command and one go off of a central configuration file. So a little bit of the YAML goodness there that lets you describe, these are the OpenShift releases I want to mirror, these are all the catalogs I want to mirror, these are the operators inside those catalogs I want to mirror, down to the version or the channel, and then off it goes, right? And it can do that with any registry you have. Could be the mirror registry, could be a production-grade method-grade deployment, you name it. That's why it's a separate tool, right? But it both comes as part of OpenShift, and it's both supported, so shouldn't be a problem from that perspective.
Yeah, and that was another thing that we, when we did the disconnected deep dive, we were just a little too early to show. Instead, we ended up walking through the process of doing the, OCA to ADM mirror and all of that other stuff, and walking through all those steps, which has now been dramatically simplified. So I'm going to use this to change direction slightly. So there's a question here from Khalid about the best way to deploy Quay. And, one, I think we can use that as an opportunity to show the Quay instance that we have running. But two, talking about ACM and Quay together. So going back to what we were talking about before of Quay entitlements are included as a part of OpenShift Platform Plus. And so is ACS, and so is ACM, and so is OpenShift Container Platform, OCP entitlements. So, you can absolutely deploy Quay via ACM. Whether or not it's the best way, in my opinion, is a very subjective thing. Like everything Linux and Kubernetes and OpenShift, there's at least half a dozen different ways to do things. One thing I will highlight, and Daniel, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that ACM, ACS, and Quay all qualify as infrastructure workloads. So you can deploy, so you can deploy a quote unquote hub cluster that is effectively control plane and all infra nodes and requires no entitlements. And then you can, you can scale, those services as you need to for all of the other, managed clusters that happen to be out there that you're using. And again, because it's all infrastructure workload, there's no entitlements required with that. So I thought that was a really cool, thing when we announced OpenShift Platform Plus, and all of those being infra workload.
Yeah, it's actually true also for regular OpenShift. So if you run regular OpenShift non-Platform Plus, you have infrastructure nodes. You can run ACM, ACS, and Quay there. You obviously need a subscription for each of those components, but you don't need the subscription for the underlying OpenShift nodes that run them as workloads in parts, right? OpenShift Platform Plus even goes a step further because all of these products are part of that bundle, right? So very simplified way of buying all into this. And Quay is actually part of that bundle as well. And not only that, it's an all-you-can-eat Quay offering. So if you have OpenShift Platform Plus, you can deploy as many Quay instances and registries, independent registries, as you like and as you need. I talk to many customers who actually have 2 instances always because they have a staging instance and then a production instance. We also have customers who are doing this with, the geo-replication feature of Quay, where you can actually deploy Quay, let's say, across your data center in the US and your data center in the EU, and you can make it look like it's one big federated Quay with no difference to the client, right? So that's all available, and you don't need to worry about any of that subscription-wise if you have OpenShift Platform Plus.
And
when you talk about like deploying Quay, do we want to quick look at a cluster running the Quay operator, because that will kind of get some insight into how.
Yeah. And while you're sharing your screen real quick, one other thing I wanted to highlight with OpenShift Platform Plus, this is something I recently learned. So Quay is the only one that you can, like, once you deploy it, it doesn't matter what nodes or what clusters are accessing it, even nodes outside of OpenShift. So with OpenShift Platform Plus, with the ACM and ACS deployments, you either have to use it can only manage other Platform Plus entitled nodes, or you have to have add-on licenses effectively. But with Quay and the Quay deployments, you can deploy that, that Quay instance, and then, other Kubernetes, other non-Kubernetes things that need to access and store images can all access that Quay instance. So I thought that was really interesting, of just a way to gain access to Quay and centralize that registry instance. But so yeah, Daniel, if you don't mind, please do share. We've got about 10 minutes ish left. I do have a hard stop today, so I want to keep an eye on the clock for myself, selfishly. But as always, for anybody who's watching, you can follow up. You can send us emails. You can send us messages on social media, whether it's Twitter, whether it's Reddit now, whether it's LinkedIn, etc. So you're welcome to send us any messages, and we'll be sure to follow up on any questions.
All right, then let me share my screen in a second. I have, as you probably can imagine, many tabs open, so I need to ensure I have the right one open.
I don't know what you're talking about as I'm looking at my screen with like
I'm pretty
tabs.
sure you have like one browser instance and like just one tab open. But you should see OpenShift at this point, if the screen share is coming through the screen as well. So
there we go.
Cool. So I'm in an OpenShift cluster here. It's 4.9, the latest version. And what I've done is I've actually installed the Red Hat Quay operator in this cluster. And that's really how you deploy Quay, with the Quay operator. The Quay operator is taking care of everything that's needed to lifecycle Quay deployment. And that makes it immediately subject to any kind of GitOps mentality, right? Because all that's needed is you need to lay down an object called Quay registry. So this is the one API that this operator has. It's a custom resource definition. And once you have it, you basically have control over a Quay deployment. So I have prepared one here. You see the kind here. It's called Quay registry. And you see this operator is already reporting quite some information at this overview stage, right? It essentially reports general availability of the Quay instance, as well as all the components that make up a Quay deployment. So Quay deployment really is many components working together. So let's take a look at the components here. So what you need for Quay is a database. We use Postgres for this. You also need an object storage. In that object storage, Quay will store the actual layer blobs. So the individual parts that make up a container image will be stored in an object storage. And we support various object storage providers and vendors, but that's what's needed. There's also Redis. Redis isn't necessarily needed for every Quay deployment, but when you use a feature of Quay that's called builders, which is Quay building your container images right inside the registry, Redis would be required to have these build logs stored for you to review how your container file / Docker file build went. We also have autoscalers here that make the Quay deployment go scale out and scale down in case that's needed from a load perspective. There's also route management with the operator, so the operator will also create all the necessary ingress configuration for your registry to be available to the external world. It sets up monitoring, of course, that's integrated in the Openshift Monitoring dashboard. I actually haven't looked at this in this instance here, but we could potentially just try that real quick because it integrates into Openshift Monitoring. So let's see if it's there. There's Quay. So I use Openshift Monitoring to essentially monitor the Quay deployment that's managed by the operator. And we have an integrated dashboard here. So you see, I've been fiddling with this over the course of the day and preparing this demo. And now it's been quite down. But here you can see, what the usage of the registry is, in terms of users, repos, CPU percentage, memory, and so on. So it's pretty neat and integrates right inside OpenShift's monitoring dashboard. So that's what this monitoring component is doing. And then there's TLS. This is the way of the operator allowing you to provide your own TLS certificates in case you have one. In this configuration, it is actually managed by the operator, and that means it's just going to delegate this TLS certificate management to OpenShift. And then last but not least, there's Claire. Claire is the image scanner component of Quay. Quay is not only storing and protecting access to your container images, it also scans them for security vulnerabilities. And that means you can actually look at your images before they hit the cluster and look at which packages are installed there, Debian packages, Alpine packages, Red Hat RPM packages, and reason about whether or not these packages are actually containing known CVs, known security vulnerabilities, right? So you can take a look at that upfront before it even hits the cluster. I skipped over one component here that's called mirroring. Mirroring is another functionality of Quay. Normally, the way you use the registry is you push content inside, either regularly, manually with your Podman/Docker client, or as part of a build pipeline, right? But Quay can also ingest content from other registries using the mirroring feature, which means you can have Quay autonomously mirror every night at midnight certain parts of Docker Hub or your own registry, right? For availability purposes, improving pull performance, and so on.
So is Quay able to act as a proxy registry?
It will be. So we are working on that feature in 3.7. So proxy means Quay transparently fetches something from an upstream registry like Docker Hub or GCR and serves it as it would be stored inside Quay itself. And it does this transparently, and it caches this. So it does this once the first time the client pulls the image, and then it downloads it into its internal cache. So that is, the download speed is the same as if you would pull the image directly from the upstream registry. But once you pull it a second time by another client, for instance, think of another node in Openshift running the same workload and you're scaling out, that pull will be served directly from Quay and would be very fast, right? And Quay maintains cache coherence by itself. So this is going to be coming in 3.7. It's a pretty neat feature because, Docker Hub put up these rate limits over a year ago.
Yeah.
Which are pretty nasty if you have a CI pipeline. So you can use Quay as a cache in 3.7 this quarter to avoid that.
And Benjamin asks what I think is a tangential question, which is, will allow mirror by tags be supported within image content source policy?
That is something that we're working on at the OpenShift side. Right now, it's not supported. We only mirror if you reference the image by digest. I know that these are very tightly intertwined feature requests, caching in Quay and mirroring by tag in OpenShift, because what it would allow you to do is to say, at the runtime level in OpenShift, all pull attempts to, let's say, everything in Docker Hub library project, pretty popular project, is cached by this Quay instance here, right? And that would be totally transparent to clients because of this mirroring by tag feature. We are not there yet. So last I heard is we are looking at that for 12, but we are working on it. At department level, you can just do this with the registry.conf. In OpenShift, we sort of have the stance that you only do this for images referred to by tag, by digest. So you can be absolutely sure that what you wanted to get is actually what you get, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and Johnny, do you know the context for Khalid's question there? Scan the image before?
Yeah, I think he's asking about Claire. If when you pull an image in, is Claire going to scan the image before it pulls it into Quay? or maybe it might be before deployment? Like when does Claire do the scan essentially?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. So Claire scans everything that's inside OpenShift, inside Quay, excuse me. The scanning part is actually interesting. So what it will do, it will actually look at the image content first. Images are immutable. So the image content, as in all the RPMs, DBN packages, Alpine packages, APKs, and whatnot, that are found inside, stays the same over the lifetime of the image, right? That's the immutable part. So Claire actually starts to index what's inside all those images in all the layers, right? It understands what an RPM database is. It can read this and figure out which RPMs are in that image. And then on a continuous basis, every 60 minutes by default, it will compare that to a list of known vulnerabilities per RPM from vendors like Red Hat, because we provide this data as part of the subscription value add to our customers. So while the image is actually exploded on disk only once by Claire when it's being loaded into Quay, it'll be continuously updated. We call this matching against CVE databases. So it's not like we need to rescan the image every time, which means you need to download the image, you need to unpack the tarball, and you need to figure out, is this an RPM database, is this an Alpine image, and whatnot. That only happens once. That only has to happen once because images are immutable. And then we only continuously update every 60 minutes which CVEs are known for these packages I identified in this image. And that happens autonomously in the background. You don't need to do anything for this. It's continuously updated by Claire. And that is kind of how it scans images, right? So the image is available before the security vulnerability results are available. You can pull the image with the scanning still being in progress, no problem. But when the image is arriving in Quay, it will actually be dispatched to Claire for scanning and matching.
And to be clear, Claire only operates at the package level. It's not doing like code analysis or anything like that. So for example, let's say that your container build process is going in and it's doing like a pip3 install, requirements.txt. It's not going to look at each one of the Python modules that's being pulled down. It's looking at... It's
actually going to do that. No,
oh, really?
It is actually going to do that. So what Claire does is package analysis. Could be operating system packages, but it could also be programming language package manager dependencies, right? So pip is one example, and we actually support Python. So Claire will report Python vulnerabilities in your image. And we've actually started to add more programming languages as well. So Java is next. We had this pretty public log4j CVE in the news a couple of weeks back. So that's kind of perfect timing right now, because we are extending this package coverage so that Claire understands what a jar archive is. And it can also start to index content there. So that's coming. What Claire generally does not do, it's not doing source code analysis. So it's not going to tell you, oh, this malloc call is probably very dangerous. So you have a vulnerability here that exposes you to some sort of buffer overflow scenario. Or you're not parsing that user input correctly. So somebody could trigger an SQL injection. So that's not what Claire does. Claire has no access to the source code, but it has access to the binaries. And because there are databases that we maintain, that others maintain, that tell you which binary, as in which package, has certain CVEs, attached to it, we can create those reports. And that extends in the future way into programming languages. So Java is the next first step.
That's
I'm thinking of NPM, right? Everything that's very popular among, cloud native workloads.
Well, I've learned multiple new things today. That was a big one. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so if you want to return real quick to the deployment, so this is a running deployment, so you can see pods running here, right? You can also do deployment, so all of that is managed by the operator. And if you then log on to Quay, this is what it looks like, right? So I'm a user here. And Andrew, let me know if you can see the repository screen. But I think
looks good.
Yeah, so this is kind of the user view of Quay. So I'm a user in Quay. So I see sort of my organizations that I have access to. I have my home organization that is named like me, my user, dmesser. And I have also access to another organization that I created here, Mirror. So organizations are like projects in OpenShift or namespaces in Kubernetes. It's a place where collaboration happens. And you can dive into these, right, and see the content in there. So I have like 2 repositories in here, Postgres 10, for instance, and I see the various tags. So I pushed a tag here a couple of hours ago. That's the RHSCL official Postgres 10 image. And that, as you can see, has 2 vulnerabilities, right? So we can actually see that the Python package scanner has detected that there is a Python CVE in that package, in the URL lib-free Python import. So that's not an RPM. That's a Python import that's probably used in some capacity by this Postgres version in there, right? And Claire sees this and sees the version and also tells you what the attack vector is. And it's putting this data from the National Vulnerability Database. And it will tell you that this is actually an attack vector coming over the network. And it's very low to exploit this attack vector. So you should probably better update that image here, right? Sooner or later.
So I'm going to use the fact that you pointed out that that's an RHCL image, official image that has some, vulnerabilities highlighted in it. So Adil asked about how, scanning Red Hat images, official Red Hat images with things such as FluentD, with things such as JFrog, etc., reveals vulnerabilities inside of there. And, is that something that, basically, what does that mean? Does that mean that there are, Red Hat isn't updating images? Does that mean that the customer needs to do things to update those images?
Yeah, we don't care about any of that. Like, who needs updated images, right? Jokes aside, that's a big problem in the industry, right? So, like, my engineering manager used to make this joke, saying, you ask the man of 1,000 watches what time it is, and he will not know, right? This is the problem that you have when you're using third-party vulnerability scanners with images coming from Red Hat, because these scanners don't understand how we backport security fixes, right? They also don't understand how the vulnerability that may come from a library, being very abstract, actually relates to an exploitable path in our code. I give you an example, right? So in the Quay image, even as of today, Quay itself is also a containerized piece of software, as you can imagine. There is a certain XML library that we use to parse some configuration data. And that library has a known vulnerability attached to it. And this vulnerability can only be exploited if you feed this parser some sort of very bogus XML, and that's when it creates a attack vector, right? The Quay image will never be reported as being affected by that CVE, because the Red Hat project team went in and looked at it and saw there is no way you can feed an XML file into Quay that it would be processed by that library. The only way, the only place in Quay where we deal with an XML file is a static XML file that's part of the image, that's not user manipulatable, right? Or that's not maintainable by the user.
Yeah.
And that's why it's not affected. So you need to differentiate between, is there an CVE, or are we actually affected by that CVE? And you will get lots of false positives from other scanners if you just feed them UBI, because these scanners don't understand that we backput security fixes into RPM versions, that we are not bumping the RPM version at the patch level. We are appending a build string or not a build ID to it. And these scanners don't see that, right? They see, oh, it's version 1.0, it must have this vulnerability. And then UBI suddenly has like 600 vulnerabilities, right? And then they are also not taking into account that sometimes these vulnerabilities aren't applicable, right? Because there is no way a user can put in a user-manipulated XML file. So it's not a vulnerability that's exploitable. And that's why it's important to not only have a scanner, but also have good scanner databases. Context, and we at Red Hat maintain these databases for Red Hat products, all of the Red Hat products. And these are the databases that Claire in Quay is using. And that's why there's a much higher accuracy about what's actually vulnerable, right? So if I look at UBI here, I pulled every UBI release that is currently on the Red Hat registry. So all the way back to 8.3, and you see this is a source image here, and you see some of them have vulnerabilities, right? It will take a time to load, but you see that updating your images is also pretty important in UBI in particular, because you need to update to the newest minor version, because no CVEs are backported to older minor versions in UBI. It's basically obsolete as soon as the next minor version comes out. And that's why you, in older UBI images like 8.3 here, you see lots of vulnerabilities that are being found. Newer UBI versions, you wouldn't see this. Yeah. That's why it's important to get images from Red Hat, because we spin our image builds very regularly, right? So that they are running off the newest UBI. Most of the vulnerabilities actually come from the base image, or they come from dependencies that your package manager pulls in, like say Python or NPM, right? So that's why it's important to always pull the latest software from redhat.com and scan the software with a Red Hat approved scanner. We actually launched a scanner certification program last year already, that certain versions of JFrog X-Ray, for instance, are part of. So you need to also look at, are you using the newest version of JFrog X-Ray? And then this problem of many false positives, hundreds of CVEs in one image that's just 3 gold will go away. But not everyone participates in that because it entails to using our CVE feeds, which not everybody is doing. But Claire is doing that, and that's why Claire has a very high accuracy of Red Hat content that it's scanning, and it gives you a much more precise statement about how vulnerable are you, how bad is this, what you're currently facing, right?
Yeah. So in the interest of time, and because there's supposed to be somebody ringing my doorbell at any minute, I'm just going to ask one more question, which comes from user Ben Cat. rhope9, I see your question. If you don't mind following up via email, andrew.sullivan@redhat.com, we'll get that answered. Anybody else who has questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. If we missed your question, if like earlier, I completely missed the context and answered your question wrong, don't hesitate to reach out. We'll get those taken care of. We'll also address those during next week's stream too. So Kat asks, is the public Quay service ready for Cosign?
Yes, it is. So Cosign is a utility to sign container images. It's actually a effort that we as Red Hat support together with Google in the SIGStore project. Very important, very interesting project. Go check it out at sigstore.dev. Cosign is a utility that essentially signs container images and stores the signature as a OCI artifact in the registry itself. So it's not the image that is kind of mutated. There's an additional kind of payload that comes with the image that looks to the standard registry as a OCI artifact. And Quay, since version 3.6, and Quay IO since last Sunday, actually has support for that. So you can use Cosign to sign your images and store them in Quay.io or Quay 3.6 or newer. And you will see the signatures appearing there. That's what makes these signatures and the images verifiable. And we are also looking to add a little bit more first-class experience around the UI and UX of that in the Quay user interface by visually highlighting these. So right now they'll just look at like normal image tags, but they're actually the signatures. And in the future we'll make that look a little bit nicer.
Very cool. All right. Well, as I said, and as Stephanie posted into the chat there, please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. Email is, of course, fine. You can also reach out on social media at Practical Andrew on Twitter or on Reddit. Johnny, I will throw him under the bus as well, JONNY at redhat.com, and JRockTX1 on Twitter. So just a quick reminder for everybody, be sure to subscribe to whatever platform you happen to be on. We've got a lot of interesting shows coming up. Daniel, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I feel like we might have put this one together slightly last minute, which was more my fault than anybody else's, but this has been phenomenal. It's been, really, really good. And I've learned a lot. I was aware of Quay and many of the things, but I wasn't like knowledgeable on it. And now I feel much better about it. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And Johnny, as always, good to see you again. I'll leave you with the last word.
All right, thank you. Yeah, good seeing you too. Daniel, seriously, thank you. This was very enlightening. I hope that everybody that watched got a lot out of it, and feel free to hit us up if you have any questions. Stephanie, thank you for being awesome and, keeping everything together for us, because, you are the reason why we're successful. So thank you.
My pleasure.